What's going on, 3DMJers? I am here with three people after the EPC 2018. That's the European Powerlifting Conference. You probably have no idea who these gentlemen are. No, I'm just kidding. If you do, that's a travesty. This is Greg Nuckols, this is Bryce Lewis, and this is Mike Tuchscherer. These are probably three of the most respected people in powerlifting when it comes to programming, coaching, and actually being competitive athletes. So I have the pleasure today to have him here to talk about anecdotes and observations. We're going to be discussing some of the systematic approaches that Mike T uses called emerging strategies of looking at anecdotes and observations in a way that can be really useful towards programming. So once again, that's anecdotes and observations. That's AO pronounced AO. Perfect. So first, Mike, do you think you could give us a high-level summary of what emerging strategies is?
Yes. It's a systematic way of going through the individualization process. So, I guess just to keep it as short as possible, in a normal training block, which we call development cycle, you would take one microcycle worth of training, which is usually a training week, and you repeat it over and over. So that's the same exercises, the same sets, the same reps, the same RPE. So you get small fluctuations in the load, but that's the only thing that changes from one week to the next. And you just monitor the athlete's results. As long as the results are going up, you keep doing what you're doing. When the results stop going up, then you go into what we call a pivot block, which you can just think of as a deload. And then you go into a new development cycle that's fundamentally different exercises, different volumes, intensities, and so on. You learn a lot of things from it. You learn how long does it take an athlete to go from the start of a development cycle to this peak condition, which seems to be a fairly stable number.
Within individual?
Yeah. It's fairly stable to that individual. So if it's 6 exposures, then it's 6 exposures for the next block and the next block and the next block as well. So it's useful for timing. And over time, you also can develop a picture of what that athlete responds best to, which intensities get them the best results, which volumes get, volumes, intensities, exercises, things like that. And that's helped me a lot throughout the individualization process. But one reason why I'm excited to talk to you guys about it is I always say that all ideas have weaknesses, and if you don't know what the weakness of an idea is, then it's just a blind spot. Mm-hmm. And if I'm a coach in the real world, then having a blind spot is going to be not a good thing. So I think I know what some of the weaknesses are to it, but at the same time, I'm always kind of wanting to know more about that.
Well, dude, first I just want to say I tremendously respect that you're like, hey, let me just on camera expose any potential, holes in my system. You know, I think that's a true sign of someone who's trying to do right by their clients and use the collective intelligence of the lifting community to improve.
Well, I'll just ask you not to post it.
Right, yeah. So if you're seeing this, he came out looking better than he does in actuality, right? So yeah, Bryce, we were talking a little bit. I wonder if you could share what you might think some of the potential blind spots might be in the system, if you think there are some.
Sure. Like when I kind of first heard about it, I was like, oh, this is different. I don't like it. And like I kind of threw up some natural resistances, but I think Mike has a ton of sound ideas here. Like number one is trying to find signal in the noise. And I think that's something that all good strength coaches are trying to do, trying to find out, okay, with everything going on, what are the things that are actually working for the athlete and how can we measure those and kind of identify those things, because presumably we want to do more of those things and less of the things that don't work as time goes on. Of a few things, the one thing I'm curious about Mike's thoughts and your guys' thoughts too is I remember you saying over the weekend that oftentimes you've got to ride out a certain configuration of a week for a few weeks before you can figure out what works or what doesn't. And if you're already waiting a few weeks to figure out what works or what doesn't, what's the difference between doing that and allowing for weekly variation before figuring out what's working and what isn't?
Well, my thinking is that you just would never know. If you have enough weekly variation, you would just never know which of the stimuli is causing the effect that you see.
Sure.
So something that I notice is you give this development cycle and you see it through to the end. There's usually one of three response types. Type 1, and all this stuff I learned from Derek Evely, learned it from Bondarchuk, so and it seems to hold for powerlifting as well. So the type 1 is just a steady increase in results throughout the development cycle. A type 2 has a dip in performance in the early stage, and then a steady increase from there. And then a type 3 is relatively stagnant performance throughout most of the development cycle until the very end, where you might get a dip, but there's a spike in performance. So it's really the type 3 that kind of throws a wrench into things. Because if everybody was a type 1, you could just look at like each exposure, right? Like I did 5s last week and I'm better this week, therefore 5s are good for me. But it's that type 3 response where you may be stagnant for 8 weeks and then have a spike at the very end that kind of throws a wrench into things.
Question for you guys, like, are there any physiological reasons why there would be such extreme different types to exposure to strength training?
So why would some people need a different number of exposures or even have a different pattern to how they progress? That I could speculate, but I wouldn't be confident in any of them. You know, I think that's one of the whole points of talking about anecdotes and observations. It's like, is it even worth speculating? Like, it might be if that actually might change your decision.
Yeah.
But I think we're so far from knowing all the different pieces that go into that I'm not sure it'd be useful. I don't know. What do you think, Greg?
No, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, Bryce, I was thinking I also had a natural resistance, and I think probably just for those of you who are following, to get an idea of probably why that natural resistance occurred is technically, if you're not modifying load, if it's just RPE, and if you're keeping the same sets and reps, it's not technically periodized within the mesocycle. Which, while none of us have the illusion that periodization is like the magic, amazing key that it could be, and we definitely understand that it has limitations, and Greg has written about them, to have a completely unperiodized plan, especially for elite level powerlifters, is counterintuitive. Now, that's not to say that I don't think emerging strategies isn't periodized, because you have multiple blocks that are different. Is that accurate?
Yes.
So, if anything, it's like a auto-regulated reactive block periodized model.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, I would say so. So the way that the block sequence works out is after you start to develop this picture of this works well for an athlete, say you take whatever it is that's most effective, and that's what you put immediately before the competition. What's second most effective? Well, that's what goes in the block before that. And you rarely find yourself trying to string together more than 2, maybe 3 blocks, because more than that, the unpredictability just kind of gets out of hand. Something always happens, you know.
Right.
So you string together 2 or 3 of, you know, your most effective blocks, and that could be and is for the average powerlifter what you would see as a linear progression, like the intensity gets higher, because most powerlifters respond well to that, which is why that's, in my opinion, that's why that's common practice. But some don't. Some have negative reactions to high intensity and really positive reactions to something else. Well, if you have a negative reaction to high intensity, why would you do that before a competition? Well, you wouldn't, obviously, but my problem was I was never able to see that before I started looking at it in this way. I had an athlete for a number of years, and we would train, things are going great, and then we get close to the competition and things just kind of fizzled. You know, sometimes you get these little nagging injuries, and when we started doing this emerging strategies thing, I noticed it's like every time we touch high intensity, that's when it happens, so let's just not do that. You know, and that worked great, but it presented some other problems, so it became this game of trying to find what's just the minimum amount of high intensity stuff we can do so that we know where your strength is at, and then we go into the meet and have actual good attempt selection. So it wasn't really a strength development thing, it was more of a tactical thing.
Right.
Just to clarify here real quick, if you were going through this process and you try a lower intensity approach, maybe auto-regulated, how did you tell that someone was making better progress? So were they hitting like sets of 5 at RPE 6 and the weight they were using was going up at a faster rate or something like that?
Yeah, so I typically don't go that low RPE, but and if I'm going to go really low percentage, then there will be a benchmark somewhere in there.
Okay.
So maybe they'll do a set of 5 at a 9 RPE, but that's one set and the bulk of their work is 70% or something like that. So we can benchmark the performance off of the harder set, but the bulk of the work is done somewhere else, the easier set. That may be one tactic that you would use.
Okay.
So that benchmark set is kind of what allows us to gauge the progress with a relative degree of accuracy.
I was having a hard time picturing like where's the thermometer in this system.
Yeah.
So I think my reservations are primarily practical. Conceptually, I like the idea, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Practically, each one of these developmental blocks is, like 5 to 8 weeks or something like that?
On average, yeah.
So let's just say the only variables we're dealing with are volume, RPE, frequency, and exercise selection. And within each of those variables, there's 4 or 5 levels of them that you could test, all independently, which would be, like hundreds or thousands of possibilities.
Yeah.
So, like, obviously, you're not testing all of those.
Right.
Because you'd have to work with a lifter for centuries. So, like, just kind of practically, how do you know that you have hit on something that is the best for that lifter? Or do you just kind of go until you find something that works and assume that it's good enough?
I don't think you can know. Mm-hmm. I think you know that it's better than anything you've tried so far.
Fair.
So I have I would call it a balance between like exploring development cycles and focused development cycles. So if we're training for a major comp, then it's focus. It's something that we have good reason to believe this should work. But if we're further away, hey, let's explore a little bit. We think this will work. Hey, this seems fun. Let's try it and see what your reaction is. And you can use, I think you can use past experience to inform some of that. So, let's say you tried triples and that wasn't so good, and then you tried 5s and that was a bit better. Well, maybe try 8s, and is it better still, and does it keep pushing you in that direction?
Do results get better than 5s?
That's the pinnacle, actually.
I believe it's pronounced 5s.
Indeed.
Okay, so...
But before you move on, you hit on a thing that I think is... It's a weakness in this system, but it's a weakness in all systems. That there's a hard problem of data here. That you collect data, and no matter how much data you collect, it's got a shelf life.
Yeah.
Because the lifter that you are now is not the same lifter you were 2 years ago. So how valid are those trials?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to ask next. So like when you're planning for a meet, and you want to run the best developmental cycle right before the meet, like how recent does that developmental cycle have to be?
Good question. I mean, the more so say you run development cycle X and get a good result. Well, the more you run development cycle X, the less true that's going to be because you start to acclimate to that stimulus. But then if you never use it, then it's still going to you're still going to expire at some point.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to manage, and I think that's kind of the give and take that you have to work with to try to manage that. But the analogy that I came up with, I don't know if it's a good one or not, but I think finding the ideal individualized plan is like trying to find your way through a cave in the dark. And something like this, a tool like this, doesn't light up the whole cave because there's things that you just can't try all the variables. So it's a little pin light, you know, and you can maybe see a few things around you. The other problem is the rocks in the cave move around from time to time. You know, like we're saying that you're not the same athlete that you were. So it doesn't solve the whole problem of perfectly individualizing a plan, but I would rather have a pen light than no light at all. Which, to be fair, that's kind of, maybe that's where I was before doing this, but I don't think that's where you guys are.
Right.
You know, I think that was kind of a false assumption that I had when I was first doing this. I'm like, does nobody else see this? You know, but you guys have, and you've got a different approach to it, that you're not changing variables as drastically as maybe I was, or maybe a lot of other coaches are, within the training block. So you do get a better sense of what an athlete's response to a given stimulus is. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, so I think on that specific point of what your preconceptions were going into it, I think that's important to give some context around it. So for one, when you got into the game, the West Side approach was big.
Yeah.
And I would, to try not to put them down too much, I think the average person who saw themselves as a West Side practitioner would use what I would describe as randomization and call it variation. So that they were changing things so frequently and so significantly and without any kind of orderly fashion to it, on average, not everybody, that they were inherently not able to see the forest for the trees. And they didn't even have that pen light. Likewise, I think it's also important to point out that you work with a ton of extremely high-level athletes. So in that case, the question of good, better, and best is actually, those become much more narrow. So for example, if Bryce Lewis improves his total at all, I'm actually pretty confident we're close to optimal. Because he, just seeing progress at that point, is very near it. So I think those two things will probably help someone understand how you landed on this and why it's working well for your athletes. Because if they're improving at all, it's close enough to optimal for it not to matter the distinction between it and what might be better. On that same topic of preconceptions and potential biases that someone has coming to the table, I think the biggest weakness to it that I see is that there are baked-in biases and that you can only observe the ways of modifying training that you would modify. And I guess I just want to open that up broadly. Like, how far are you willing to step outside of the Mike T bubble to observe new things to know how close you could be getting?
Maybe I can answer what I think you're asking, and then you can tell me if I'm close.
Cool.
All right. I like to collect different strategies. So like I have my way of doing things, and we talked at the conference today about, you know, I often include assistance and supplemental exercises in different categories. But I also like to understand how somebody like you would program things and see what those differences are, or you know, I look into different camps and see, like, well, what situation might I use this in? And because you can build a strategy around any of that. Like, you could build a strategy around just comp lift only if you wanted to do that. Or like, I don't think that, like, the emerging strategy concept is a framework, and I really don't. There's only a few limitations that you would have. Like, you can even include variation within that, as long as it was a pattern that repeated with some regularity. Now, if it's a 10-week-long pattern, then you never really, that's too much to be manageable, you know. But, you know, if you had a alternating weeks, you can do that, and we do that with some athletes. Some athletes have a great response to that type of thing, but that's, you know, kind of veering off topic maybe, but that's not the default of where we start usually, you know. Is that even close?
So like, to kind of use an extreme example, if you notice that one of your lifters just responded really well to high intensity work, do you think you'd ever find yourself at the Bulgarian system? Like, if I understood Eric correctly, like, it seemed like he was asking, like, not
like,
necessarily,
you just followed the data.
Yeah, like, not necessarily just what variables are you willing to touch, but more like, how far out of the sphere of what you typically do would you be willing to venture?
I think you could end up at the Bulgarian system. Now, whether I'm let's take a theoretical athlete that we can look at our crystal ball and say that is the best way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm a good enough coach to follow to get to that answer,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
you know. But that's the other thing that I see as maybe a potential weakness to it, but I'm not even so sure that it's a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
It really emphasizes coaching skill. And I think that's a thing that doesn't get talked about enough, that there is absolutely a skill component to being a good coach. And some coaches are good at it and some aren't. And some people just have a knack for it and some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about just the program. You know, now, yeah, and I don't know if my skill is enough that I can get that far out of what I would normally do.
Mm-hmm.
But in theory, you could.
So that makes a lot of sense to me. So what you're saying is the emerging strategy, for lack of a better word.
Framework. Yeah.
Thank you, is a framework that any coach could use,
Yes.
given the data set, given the analytical tools you have, and that it could be shittier or less shitty, depending on how
100%.
how much you pay attention and how wide of a net you're willing to cast,
Mm-hmm.
and how appropriately you're willing to cast that net. So even if that is a weakness of the system, it's not a different weakness than any other style of programming.
Well, that's the thing I keep coming back to, and like we started talking about weaknesses in the system. The ones that I've found, I'm like, yeah, that's a weakness to the system, but I don't see how that's a weakness that doesn't exist in other systems.
Right.
It's just that
That's fair.
I think it tries to meet it head on, you know?
So here's one thing I'm considering is that any system that uses this probably needs to employ autoregulation or some way of allowing for change in load week to week, because that's the key thing that's changing.
Well, you could. So as Bondarchuk coached throwers and had people lifting, he used a fixed load approach. And the idea was, well, as you got stronger during the course of the development cycle, you would lift faster. you
Okay.
know?
Okay.
So you could do that. I haven't dabbled in that.
Sure.
Yeah, so you just need something to gauge the temperature, like you said, Bryce.
Yeah.
So you could have velocity of a fixed load. You could have an AMRAP on a fixed load, or you could have an estimated 1 RM based on RPE, like you do.
Right. And I'm aware of some people who've tried this with AMRAPs and found it to be successful. Like, I thought that, well, you're going to get different reps, and so that's kind of a different stimulus. I don't know if that's going to work, and they said it seems to work just fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively small portion of the stimulus. You
Right.
know? I mean, it is more than a single at 8 RPE,
Yeah.
but it certainly wouldn't be the bulk of it. So I would think it would be a reasonable temperature gauge.
Right.
Hey folks, thanks for watching this first half of my discussion with Greg, Mike, and Bryce. Next week, we're going to continue the discussion. That's where we'll finish this two-part AO episode, 10 and 11. In the second half, the discussion gets a little more interesting as we go into the individual strategies that each of us use that are similar and in some ways different to the emerging strategies approach that Mike takes. So take a look next week, tune in, and I look forward to seeing you then.